is Locke. We are the research and development portion of what's currently at stake today. Been around for almost a year, and we've been developing relationships with various companies, offering a full breadth of services ranging from design services to sort of back-end stuff that we're finding in these forensics. Forensics are more tactical as opposed to the strategic oriented stuff we do, but we have found that we do have to do them. There are companies, small boutiques, that have been helping law enforcement in the state of Texas, the state police there, use some boutique services to do their forensics. And I've been in close contact with quite a few of them while bringing up the forensic lab at State and determining what kind of services we'll be offering. So I found that forensics weren't being looked at very strategically, so I thought that would be a good topic to start talking about. That was definitely something I found as I looked at it more and more. So, okay. Basically, one of the first things that I got into when I was starting to learn about this stuff was an article from the RCMP website, and it was written by an FBI agent, the article was. It was basically about what the forensic process is, and it was identified as a four-step process, starting with the acquisition, which would basically be going out and getting the system, capturing the system that's been compromised. Identification, which is more or less an inventory of what's on the system, some sort of technical analysis to describe what kind of things are living on that system. From there, it is passed on to the evaluation phase, which is typically done by lawyers. This is not something that any of the forensic, the technical people get involved in. It's mostly determining whether the findings that came out of identification are actually relevant to the case and whether they can stand up in court, whether they'd be able to be presented as evidence or not. And then finally, the presentation phase could occur as many as maybe 4 years after the actual investigation has occurred. So it becomes really important to take notes about what was actually done, because you may be sitting on a court stand a good 4 years from when you actually did it. So it's tough to remember. It makes it really important to follow a process and to take copious notes in terms of any kind of detail from that. On the acquisition side, one of the things that you have to start off with is realizing what it is you're trying to get out of this. Some people, there's all sorts of reasons to be doing forensics. One of the most obvious reasons is to support a court case. A lot of other people are simply interested in finding out how deep the intrusion went and how they can stop it. Other people are actually using forensics to basically find out what's going on the field, discover new exploits. And Lance Spitzner from Sun has been doing a lot with his honey net, basically a giant honey pot that he does forensics on, simply to learn what other people have found. Identification, during the identification phase, we use a number of tools, basically working on copies of data as opposed to the original, to determine what was on that system. And finally, in presenting it, probably be useful to get some guidance on testimony. That's something that I personally don't have a lot of experience with yet on the presentation side. I know from speaking with the people that have the boutique-oriented people that have been working on forensics for quite a while professionally, that they find that testifying in court that they've never submitted anything that they themselves couldn't throw out. So the evidence is kind of shaky, and that makes it all the more important to get this stuff down right. There was a case fairly recently, there's only one case I can actually think of where computer evidence has been thrown out. It was the CD Universe case. And that basically cost the whole case. It was thrown out because the evidence was found to be collected in a non-acceptable way, so it wasn't significant as evidence. Okay. Beyond those four steps, there's actually, I believe, a number of things that happen prior to the acquisition of the data from the compromised systems. The first step is incident response, or actually the first step that I'll mention is incident response is actually something prior to that. But in terms of incident response, I thought a good thing to bring up here would be a couple things that you can start doing if you're unfamiliar and inexperienced with forensics. Things that will not affect the system, but that can give you a little bit more information about what's going on prior to calling in someone who's got a level of expertise beyond what you have in-house. The first thing is not to start looking for files. Stuff like LS and find and all those utilities that you're going to be using to actually go through the system and find out what was going on, they actually taint the data right off the bat. There are things, attributes of files that basically track when the files were modified, accessed, and created. Those timestamps will change with normal utilities, so it's important to go in there with the right utilities, and as such, it's important that as system administrators that poking around is absolutely minimized. The first thing you do want to do is establish an evidence custodian, someone who's basically going to act as a focal point for the case, and make sure that everybody that touches the equipment is accounted for, and that people are actually logging what they do in terms of just a journal type logging. You want to designate the equipment as off limits. You will not always be able to do this, obviously. If it's a production environment, you won't be able to stop production in some cases. In other cases, if it's obvious that an intrusion has occurred and the intruder is still on the system, you may not want to tip them off that basically you've discovered their presence. So it's not always possible to actually make the equipment off limits. But in terms of things that are really important in that vein, first, you don't want to be doing backups. A lot of people will tend to do a backup of the system that's been compromised simply to try and capture the data, get a copy of it that they can work on. Stuff like dump, UFS dump, and your standard backup utilities from Legato and whatnot, they will affect those access times, so those are not the tools that you want to be using. We use DD to actually copy them off on a partition level, mount them up on other systems. Other stuff in terms of any kind of remotely or locally executed jobs that do housekeeping or whatnot should definitely be turned off if at all possible. And any configuration changes are definitely out of the question. The other thing is if physical access to the computer is actually part of what will support part of your case that you're trying to make. You definitely want to make the computer physically off limits to folks, especially in terms of preserving fingerprints, any kind of latent evidence like that. You want to quarantine this system. Other things you can do, you can start to help the forensic effort when you ship this stuff over to the labs for further analysis. Some of the stuff that the lab people would really like to see would be some sort of collation of other sources of data to say what went on. Just as a smoking gun needs extra elements to actually, you can't indict someone with a smoking gun. You still need to prove motive, that they don't have an alibi and whatnot. If you can provide multiple points of data, you're making a stronger case. And sometimes it's actually the data that's missing from the host level system that exists over on the DNS servers and the mail logs and whatnot that will be of interest, because that will indicate that your system's been compromised and the accounting on that system has been compromised. Something else you can do, unless you've TCP wrapped the system, and obviously these systems are your systems, so you'll be familiar with their configurations, hopefully. But unless you've TCP wrapped the system, which will make it obvious that it's been port scanned to the intruder, you probably want to do a port scan, see if you can identify any kind of ports that are listening. Possibly even sniff out on the network with some sniffer and see if you can see data coming in. Be able to identify what kind of backdoors are being used based on that type of stuff. And obviously you're going to want to contact management and any kind of internal computer response teams you've got. This is a talk I've done actually a couple times in the U.S. So it is a little U.S.-centric. There's obviously counterparts over here in Europe for the FBI. One of the most important things, though, is contacting the other affected sites. Again, I'm not particularly well versed on the European law enforcement community, but I know that for the FBI, Anytime that you're dealing, especially with a foreign site, it's a lot easier for you as a system administrator to talk to the other system administrators than it is for the FBI to get involved. They have a lot of paperwork that they have to do, and their hands are pretty much tied outside their jurisdiction. They obviously can help out the number of relationships that they've got, but it's a lot easier for you to actually go one-on-one with other affected sites. Either sites that are attacking you that probably were broken into themselves, or sites that you might be attacking as well. And then packaging, labeling, and shipping. Obviously, different groups are going to have different skill sets in-house. A number of the things I'll mention on the next slide could very well be done in-house if the experience sat there. But in terms of packaging and labeling, I know the preferred way for us is basically to just mimic what the FBI does, which is to use USPS registered mail. It's the United States Postal Service. Some sort of registered mail would be the best, because you're going to try to be keeping a chain of custody through this whole thing to show who had possession of the system at what time, and therefore what other elements could have been introduced along that chain. Also, short-term storage. This is one of the areas that we are working on to help our clients. We're building an evidence locker, basically. It's currently using some classified document containers that we picked up at an auction. There were some nuclear subs that were actually scheduled to be built, and they had some document containers built for them to hold classified information. That contract got canceled, so they had a bunch of safes up on the block. So we happened to pick one of those. What we are looking at augmenting that with is actually, we're currently putting in card access for an audit trail, basically, in terms of the physical access to the room, as well as remotely recorded cameras, which are basically triggered off of motion detectors and feedback to long playing tape decks. You can get up to 10 hours on a VHS tape, and couple that with motion sensing cameras, and you can get quite a long span, actually, as long as you keep that in a low traffic area. So those are the types of things. They seem a little excessive, but as things progress, what you're basically doing here is trying to throw out any reasonable doubt. So one of the areas that you can definitely gig people on is the short-term storage. I know that the boutiques that I've been talking to have quite often been storing these boxes in their bedrooms or their living rooms. They're just small businesses, and they definitely have been concerned that someone's going to question that down the line. All right. What you can do if you're more experienced, or what basically we would do if we came in to do an incident response type of thing. First time, obviously, identify the evidence custodian, or become that central point, make sure that everything's being tracked, and if it has been up to date, review what has been tracked. Next thing you would probably wind up doing would be installing a sniffer, both somewhere around the connection that we would believe the person to be coming in on. Definitely around the host. With ether switches nowadays, there would be more sniffers required on occasion. But basically, you're looking for the intruder coming in, trying to establish the time frames that they're coming in, because you're going to want to do some information collecting when they're not on the system and not able to notice you. Find out about the back doors they're coming in through. Basically, find out what other systems are being touched by the compromised system during the time that the intruder is around. That's particularly important because once the intruder has compromised one system, they may find credentials in terms of .NET RC files in users' home directories that are used for FTP authentication, or other types of trust relationships to other hosts, and their traffic is going to look completely legitimate once they get by there. So it's definitely important to find out what systems that compromised system has touched in order to determine the extent of the compromise. So once a time frame has actually been established as to when this intruder is and is not on the system, The next thing to do is start making copies of the data. We start by making copies of the data because the tools that actually collect live system information will basically write over undeleted files. So what we start off by doing is doing an MD5 checksum of the DD program itself and putting a program like CryptCat on there and basically sucking the data off the disks prior to doing any other data collection. But you do want to observe the order of volatility when collecting this information. You may collect a piece of information that actually taints another piece. So after making these physical level copies of the disk, start running the information collection programs, which for the most part in terms of live system acquisition and even ship system acquisition is going to be Graverobber, which is part of the Coroner's Toolkit, something that Dan Farmer put out quite a while ago, but just recently it's been publicly released, I believe, in version 1.3. Large portion of the community has been reviewing that for some time. So to some extent, I was talking with someone actually about the scientific evidence as it's submitted into court, and one of the things that they found was that both DNA and computers share the situation where there isn't much rigor in terms of the standards that the evidence is being held up to today. And would that information be able to stand on its own? Probably never. So basically, capturing this information becomes important to do it in the right order, and that order has been basically validated over time. The way that other scientific communities validate is normally through a journal. But the Coroner's Toolkit is an open source program and actually has a mailing list. People have been discussing it for some time, so it's almost equivalent to some sort of industry peer review. But it basically goes in and captures network information, process information, copies information about inodes, finds stuff that's running but deleted from disk, which is typically pretty suspect. All sorts of pieces of information it gathers. By the time you're done running this, any command that you would have issued to investigate the system will have already been issued. The output will be captured in MD5 hashed such that you can go back and validate that none of your data has changed down the road 4 years later when you're testifying in court. All right, so little screenshots here of the data collection process. As I mentioned, Graverobber is the primary tool that'd be used to actually capture the stuff on this system. In this case, for the screenshots, I believe I'm DDing after grave robbing, which is probably not what you want to do. Let's just go through this example here. What I've got is the sending side, which is actually the compromised host over in black, and the receiving side, which is actually the evidence server over on the right. On the left here, the first thing we did was we grave robbed the system. So that's basically going to do your netstats, your LSLF, it's going to use utilities like PCAT and ICAT to go through process and inode information and capture all that. It's basically going to issue quite a long list of commands, but most importantly in the order such that issuing one command does not affect the output of another. What I've done here is V for verbose, F to collect files, I for inode information, L I'm drawing a blank on, but there's MAC times and MD5 signatures that are also being collected, as well as interesting user information. The only thing that I'm not grabbing with this Graverobber run is live process memory, and that is sometimes dangerous. What's actually really, it's also basically slows things down in terms of putting together a presentation. But the other thing is some of the systems you're running on, they may be in production, and that is the part that crash some systems. So it's valuable information, whether you want to collect it or not, is going to have to be determined case by case. But what that will do is basically spit all these files out to the file system, and will create a directory hierarchy full of all the outputs of these commands and MD5 signatures of them. Thus, we should have DD'd up front so that undeleted files weren't actually overwritten, but in this case they will be. So after we've actually run Grave Robber and it's produced its directory of output, what we want to do is we want to get it onto another system. Unfortunately, we can't just pipe it directly onto another system. We haven't found a way to do that yet. However, what I've done here is I've basically just tarred up the contents into an archive and sent them over a utility called CryptCat. Now, CryptCat is most people are probably familiar with Netcat. Netcat was written by Hobbit quite a few years ago. Well ported it over to NT. It's basically a Swiss Army knife. Write to ports, listen on ports, port scan, do all sorts of neat TCP and UDP tricks. Somebody took CryptCat recently, the folks over at farm9.com. They took Netcat and basically added, I'm thinking it's not MD5, it was Twofish actually. They added Twofish into it. And what we can see here is actually a specification of the key that we'll use for the encrypted session. Defaults to Metallica, which is actually better to default to some constant string than to not use anything at all. But in this case, we changed the key over to forensic and have started up a listener over on the evidence server that basically says listen to port 33 and whatever you receive, pipe over to this image or this tar file basically, and we'll call Jezebel, which is the host name _gr for graverobber.tar. It's not real important, but just so you understand what's up there. And then on that side, we're using CryptCat. We're piping the tar contents out to standard out, which is being redirected over to port 33 on Whereas, which is our evidence server. We do the same thing with DD. DD will not have to write to the file system. We can pipe that over directly. So in as much, we basically issued the DD command. It's always good to specify your block size. Not necessarily that 1024 is the greatest block size in the world, but it's good to know what block size is actually in use because you're going to have to mount that system up later on. And again, we use the same key here to go over to Whereas to a different port where it was listening, and piping that information over to, this was a Sunbox, and basically the C0, T0, D0, S0 slice, which in this case was mounted up as root. In this example, this was a quick recompilation by Mr. Weld. So we are getting some core dumps, but MD5 hashing of the files on both ends will verify that your file was transferred in its entirety and nothing more. So it is functional. All you need to do is recompile it over on Solaris. It's a little ugly, but it works with very little effort. Possibly someone will put some more effort into it soon and get a Solaris version of CryptCat. It is available for PC and Linux right off the Farm9 site, so those are pretty useful tool. Up till now, people have been basically running Netcat and some sort of MD5 program or something like that independently and piping them through each other. All right, what can we do to take it offline now that we've actually gathered all that info? One of the things I prefer is real film as opposed to digital film. Again, it's no real, you can obviously forge either, but SLR is just basically a single lens refraction. It's just your standard 35mm camera. Take lots of pictures of the crime scene, especially if there's a physical component, but also to help out the labs in terms of reconnecting cables and stuff like that, depending on where you're sending it. Let's see, basically everyone has the ability to go in and modify digital pictures on their PCs nowadays. How good a job they do is variable, but I think the equipment is a little less common, although you can probably find it in your high school lab to actually modify real film. So 6 of one, half dozen of the other. I prefer to use real film just because every 3-year-old has access to paintbrush these days. Considerations before pulling the plug. One of the things to consider before pulling the plug is, are you using encrypted file systems, for instance? Again, hopefully these are machines that you are the custodian of, if you're doing this stuff too. So you'll be familiar, hopefully, with what's on them. There could be additional considerations if you're running some sort of crypto file system. There's all sorts of ways that crypto file systems are done. So I'm not going to go into great detail on what those considerations would be. They're going to vary depending on what product you're using. The next step is basically to unplug it from the network. Now, the slide says unplug from the network. There's actually taking into consideration the point right below it, if possible, freeze the system such that the current memory swap files and the CPU registers are saved. I'll use Sunbox as an example because that's the easiest and most straightforward one. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but the Sun firmware is just Forth. It's all written in Forth, and they're all Forth words when you do probe SCSI all or whatever. There's actually a fourth word, and you can see probe SCSI all, and it'll show you the fourth code behind it. One of the things you can do is we've been playing around to modify sync in such a way, out on the firmware level, that sync, such that we can control the device that it outputs to. Right now it's outputting over swap, which is not something that we wanted it to do. So basically rewriting Forth words is something that we're endeavoring in right now. The other thing is there is a fourth word called registers that will show you the state of the registers, and that may be particularly useful depending on the circumstances, like perhaps a crypto file system. Some of them may be useful to know CPU register states depending on what kind of information they're using in their crypto, but there could be other reasons to capture register. It really depends on what the goals of the whole forensic effort are, whether that is incoming to value or not. But could very well be, if you're capturing a system, that's something that you might as well grab as well. Then actually unplug the system power. Don't give things a chance to, you basically sync out on let's back up a bit. Alt out of the operating system. At that point you're off in the Forth interpreter, and you can basically issue the commands to examine the registers, sync, and unplug the system. Then you want to pack it up. Again, USPS, registered mail. If you're using FedEx or UPS, record all the tracking numbers and whatnot. Get the full shipping information, record all of it, and ship it away, hopefully to some lab that will be able to analyze this stuff. All right, what's the lab going to do? I'm going to start with the FBI list of services because it was a good starting point. There are basically the small tool set that we've been talking about so far will cover all of these, and there are other things as well that I think could be offered that I don't see up here. I don't know whether that's because they mystically included it under something else or they just don't offer that up. I'm sure they would probably do it upon request. But we start with content. What type of data? There's a number of things that we do here. Basically, we've DD'd some images off, so what we want to look at basically in the context of content on its own is basically what kind of data was in the live file system. So we've captured those DD images off. We can mount those through a loopback device on some other system and basically start going through there, inventorying stuff. Somebody recently, there was a court case going on, and somebody somehow mysteriously in the middle of this court case, records of email that were said not to exist suddenly appeared on, supposedly appeared on DLT tape, and the court's very interested in what's on there. So it could be as simple as give me a catalog or an inventory of what's on this DLT tape, and we'll debate it in court. Comparison against known data. If you've got strings that you captured during your incident response, if you see known data, ADM rocks, that shows up in a lot of exploits, stuff like that you happen to find strings basically. It's basically like keyword searching, which we also list down below. The other side of comparison, of course, is finding out, basically doing MD5 checksums of the data and comparing it at different points to mathematically prove through cryptographics that it is indeed different. Transaction sequencing, this is something that you quite often don't get. Some of it can be built off with sniffers. If those are running, those aren't always running. Process accounting is also important. That's not always turned on. but the last pound command actually should give you all the commands that were issued by the users, and that's part of the information that Grave Robber will capture. Extraction of the data, another part of the Coroner's Toolkit, other than Grave Robber, is a handful of utilities. One of them is unrm, and unrm basically does what you think it would do. It undeletes files. But it undeletes them into this gobbledygook type format that's really tough to parse through. And what you wind up doing is basically a DD image is what it gives you. And what you can do from there is use a secondary tool out of the Coroner's Toolkit called Lazarus. Lazarus takes forever to run, but will basically recover those deleted files in a way such that they look pretty much like a live file system. They'll have ugly names, and they won't necessarily be complete, but it will be pretty good recovery of deleted data presented through a web browser. So nice little utility in Lazarus. Format conversion, simple stuff. It's almost more IT than forensics, but it's stuff that the FBI lab will do, and it's stuff that may be necessary for court cases. They don't necessarily go by DLT in the courtroom. Maybe you want to just burn a CD and put it in some sort of pretty format for lawyers to read. Let me see, keyword searching we've mentioned. Also, in terms of keyword searching, that's usually done last as well as up front. Up front, we usually have some keywords that people are interested in. For instance, with the DLT, I believe there was a lot of, quite a few mail messages to go through. So the court actually thought it was going to go through them first, and then they decided that the best idea was to give a list of keywords to a forensic lab and have them see what was on there with relation to those keywords. So other stuff is password decryption that was mentioned earlier. Basically, once you've got a system and there are pieces that are encrypted, how do you decrypt them? Limited source code analysis. A lot of what you'll find on these systems is toolkits that people have pulled down. Hopefully, for them, they're fairly good at hiding them. What I've found is a couple people so far have actually liked to hide them under dev. I think they think that system administrators are unfamiliar with dev and it's a spooky place they won't go. But it makes it really easy. Their toolkits really stick out. With a simple find through the dev directory, nothing under dev should be, well, everything under dev should be either character or block special. Limited types living under dev. So if you find normal files, type F living under dev, chances are they'll be of interest, and most of the time they are. You'll find source code, you'll find binaries and whatnot. This can also tie into the listing of open files, which is sometimes interesting. If source code has actually been deleted, I don't believe the FBI does this, but this is something that we found is kind of fun. In terms of looking at the MAC times of files on the system that have been touched, which is part of what Grave Robber does during that collection, you'll see, if someone was compiling stuff on that box, you'll see header files and all sorts of stuff that were all touched within milliseconds of each other. And you can actually go and look at those header files, bring out an inventory search on the web, and chances are you'll find the source code that's requiring those includes, and you can actually see what's been compiled on the machine. And then storage media we mentioned with the DLT. The FBI likes to tell that they have all sorts of formats. I think they do typewriter ribbons and all sorts of stuff. So that's fun stuff. I would argue that password harvesting is missing from this list. We could definitely do password harvesting. Stuff like passwords that are stored in URLs. Other things, there is a law that in the US at least you are only allowed to have up to, I'm not sure if 14 puts you over or 14 is the limit, but if you have stolen credentials, you can have up to 13 or 14 of them without actually violating any laws. So if you had 13 or 14 of other people's accounts just kicking around, it's not necessarily proof that you've been harvesting them until it goes over that number. So that's something to be aware of, but harvesting of these passwords is definitely interesting because the other thing that's missing from this is the ability to identify what other systems were touched by this one. And that's really important in determining the extent of the intrusion. And those harvested passwords may come up very useful if other systems are required down the line, saves some laboratory time. All right, into summarizing the acquisition. This is what Grid Robber gives you after you run it, and this pretty much is what it looks like over on the Unix box. You have to tar it up and pipe it over to the evidence server, and then basically just untar that where we can look at it. The first thing that it does after collecting all this information in its run is it will go through an MD5 each and every one of the files that it's created, and then it'll take an MD5 of the MD5 catalog, such that if you go in and modify some of this data and then just re-MD5 it to say, oh yeah, the signature matches, that won't roll up to the upper level of the MD5 of the whole, of all the MD5s you've taken. It makes it pretty tricky to get stuff modified. But beyond that, what we have is these two files right up there, body and body.s. They are pretty useful stuff. They contain MD5 signatures, MAC times of every file in the system. The top one, body, does. Each and every file that was on that live file system has been examined in every way possible, and we'll look at that in a bit. And then the most important stuff, SUID, SGID stuff, is actually tucked away in body.s. And this is Unix-centric right now. You don't find that concept in Windows, but let's see. Other than that, we have the command out directory. Command out directory, basically every command that you would think of issuing, LASCOM, LSOF, PS, NSTAT, all that stuff, ARC. You'll find a very complete listing of the outputs along with MD5 stamps of those outputs in that command directory. We'll look at those. Confault is also pretty interesting. It's system configuration and other logs. So we'll also look at that. Proc is where it's fixed process memory, and in this case, we haven't collected process memory, so we won't bother looking at that. But it will be blocks of memory that you basically just strings through the lines for stuff. Remove but running is particularly interesting. You may find through inode comparisons that there are things in memory that aren't no longer on disk, and those would be a definite interest to you. Trust, I sort of expected to see rhost, rcommand information here, and netrc and stuff, but what I'm finding is that stuff actually makes it into the user vault. What actually goes under trust are things like time and things related to the X Windows system. So why just that, and why not the R commands? Why you expect the R commands in user vault is to be determined, I guess, but just arbitrary. And then the user vault actually has interesting files found in the user directories like history. Let's look at some of this. This is the body file. As I indicated, every attribute you could possibly imagine about these files is in here. One of the great things to do afterward, especially if you found any kind of indications of rootkits or whatnot, is each of these files. So user bin who, for instance, has been MD5 stamped. You can take this and actually, here's the URL that I provide at the end here. You can paste it into a web page, and actually, because this is the Sun system, Sun actually has a fingerprint database online, and they'll, based on an MD5 signature like that, they will return what the binary that equates to that is. So what you hope to see back is user bin who and not found, in which case you know that who has been potentially Trojan. There's also all the MAC times over here in terms of access and modification and creation, which are, again, that's the type of thing where you're looking for groups of files that were all touched within the same amount of time, and trying to pull back some sort of relevance as to why, what those were related to. And all this could obviously, you've got your bar separated data here, this could all be imported into Access or Excel or whatever to be sorted on any of those fields. So there's a real important file. Another really interesting area is the command output. This is the type of stuff that the sysadmins will want to do right when they find out there's an incident, and hopefully they won't be doing it. These have been issued in an order as to preserve the data, so we know that basically anybody could browse through it at this point and have the benefit of having done it in the right order, and the benefit of MD5 stamping all this stuff, which is really tedious. So it actually brings quite a bit of process to and discipline to the overall act that you're trying to achieve. Some of the commands that you'll see here: last pom, IPCS for shared memory, config, dmessage for boot messages, finger. If you can think of it, it's in here, and if it would be of any use whatsoever in a forensic investigation, it's in here. ARP, that was a funny one. Recently, we looked at the ARP output and found the default router on the netstat. But we were able to actually telnet to the router that was the primary gateway for this system. It's not very good. But that's the type of things that you want to make the customer aware of. Other fun stuff under the comp vault. This is all the system configuration log files. It's inetd.conf. Quite often you'll be interested in other inetd.confs, not the one in Etsy, possibly the one in Temp, depending on how the system is broken into. Last log, regarding logins, it just goes down for pages and pages. You can actually rep through all this stuff too. Directory format and a switch.conf, what's it been relying on to resolve postings and whatnot. Alright, then it's time to get a cup of coffee, because this piece takes a long time. I recently was looking at a 6 gigabit slice and gigabyte slice, right? And it took 20.5 hours to crunch through with Lazarus. So that was on a Spark 5 system. But basically, it's nothing terribly exciting. TCT 103 being the Corners Toolkit. Again, all of these tools except for CryptCat are all available for Corners Toolkit. It's a one-stop shopping. But utility is called Lazarus. And here we are we're telling Lazarus to basically don't collect binary files in this case. I wanted this particular run to go fast. That's not the run that actually took 20.5 hours. We did collect binary files in that instance. We also have this T over here, which is saying don't collect ASCII files that I don't recognize the type of. And then over here, we're telling it HTML output, where to stick the stuff. I found that I had to do these relative directories, or it encodes the whole TCT environmental variable in, and you can't just zip it up and move it over to another box. So I've been using relative directories, and you do it against basically a DD type image, which in this case was created by UNRM, but you could do the log file system or the entire disk with the DDs that you pulled off during acquisition. So what this is basically going to go do is it's going to examine byte by byte anything that's been recovered, in this case because it's RAM output, and it'll perform some heuristics on it to try and identify what type of file it is, which really gets interesting. It'll color code it, and it'll look like a bunch of gobbledygook at first, but as I explain it, you'll see how useful that can be. So after we've spent our 20.5 hours crunching our 6 gigabytes, we just basically switch over to the www directory that it created and run Netscape against the hostname drive.html. And like I said, gobbledygook. It almost looks like binary, but it's not. It's HTML output, and basically each of these characters represents some sort of block of data and its type. And unfortunately, there's no key for this up top, but I'll show you how to show you what to use for a key. We'll also let you modify the way the keys are working. But you can see the color coding makes certain things stick out. If you get, like, for instance, U seems to be Unix-related files. I find DMESG output and stuff like that in there. P is typically a program, most often Perl. We do have other programs like C. When you see the capital C followed by a bunch of little c's, that's one contiguous block that it thinks is one file, this being the starting block. But it thinks that that's C code. There's some unidentified text, and these dots are unidentified binary, I believe. But we can definitely validate that. The most important thing is there is a bright red demarcation, which isn't on this one, but it basically recognizes Snoop output. Snoop has its own type of output. That won't always work with all sniffers, but because Snoop has its own Etsy Magic number or identification in your Etsy Magic file that identifies these first X bytes of this file, this signature, and therefore the Snoop output. It does that type of thing on every block of data it can find. And if you do get Snoop output, that's going to definitely be of interest. Quite often in communication, it's been compromised. And also, we'll show you to what extent the network has been compromised. Drilling down on one of these, I picked a U in this case. Drilling down, basically, you can see that it's recovered a portion of this file. Again, it's a Unix-related file. This looks like DMESG type output, I believe. And it's incomplete. What we could do, but the nice feature of Lazarus is, in addition to the heuristics it does on the files to identify what types they are, because it's identified what types they are, you can jump to the next block of the same type or the previous block of the same type, and you can almost reconstruct these files, not with 100% certainty, but quite often they'll come back together that way. Or you can just jump over to the next block of any type, for that matter. But it's a great way to go through all the undeleted files by type, especially if you find sniffer-related stuff. Here's what you can use as a key for that. It's actually the Lazarus config file. So in addition to being able to change these values, you can actually just print this out and stick it next to your computer so that when you're looking at this output, you know what these things are. Basically, you've got compressed archives, stuff like that, based on the Etsy Magic again. GIFs and JPEGs, quite often in your porn cases, those will show up quite a bit. And most interesting is the sniffer stuff up here, which shows up as, I guess, bright red with an F, lowercase f. That again is going to be not inclusive of all sniffer output. Recently, I ran into a program, was it HME Sniff and LE Sniff? They were sitting on a box that I found, and they output the standard out. They basically only look for username password combos, and they type the standard out. But they do have this little identifying header for the log that it types the standard out, which basically says TCP/IP log. So what I wind up having to do is, in addition to the stuff that Lazarus has done to identify these files, I wind up having to go through the find, execing off a grep for basically TCP/IP log or any other kind of unique outputs that I'm seeing from the toolkit that I've actually found on the system. So while this promises a lot, it's not necessarily going to get you everything. HME Sniff will definitely circumvent this. It'll show up as a regular text file. If it was captured at all, it may have come from another system. All right, correlating log files. Where to look, where to mean, how to narrow the search, and how reliable are they? This is the other half. After we've gone through all these laboratory services and we've looked at undeleted files, we've grave robbed the system, we've done some analysis. It's not extremely structured. We're basically going out there looking to see what we find. Maybe we find a file living under dev that doesn't look like a device, and we just basically try to find things that may explain that. So each answer you get actually answers some questions. So it's sort of an unstructured look around the system. But one of the things that can give you some direction in that is correlation with external log files like DNS entries, or DNS logs rather on the server, mail logs, anything else along those lines, intrusion detection systems, firewalls, yada yada. So where to look? Obviously, all the way from the infected system, you can start going back to the network, see what firewalls and IDSs were touched, see what proxy servers were touched, what kind of mail, did the intruder utilize mail at all, is there any kind of DNS type tricks that he's playing to get in, what type of stuff is going on. So basically, one of the places to figure out where to look is by correlating these external log files and then looking on the local system to see if there's any sort of evidence that supports that. And you'll either get a second data point that way to say this definitely occurred, or you'll get you'll be missing a second data point, which will basically say something's wrong with your end system, that these network things have seen it and your end system's not, and they say that it should be. What do the log entries really mean? They don't really mean anything on their own. You want to correlate them, and you want to have an understanding of how these things are actually generated. One interesting point that will illustrate this is if you write a script, and the script contains two commands. It does a who and an LSOF. What you'll actually see in process accounting is that who and LSOF ran first, and that the script that actually contains them ran last. And that's because the process accounting is actually going on as per the time that the processes are finishing up on certain systems. I'm sure it varies from system to system. But the idea is to understand exactly what do they mean by going out with another system and basically observing how it all works and helping you understand that so you can stitch this stuff back together. Again, how to narrow your search, anything that you're finding externally. Strings is another great thing. Strings and free data is great for pulling up some sort of direction. And how reliable is the data? Not super reliable, but that's why missing data actually becomes of interest when you can support it with these network type logs that you've actually captured as well. So it's all a matter of proving how reliable this data is. We do a lot also with grave robbers and MD5 signatures to at least prove that it's reliable as it goes through you. But it really is open to interpretation, and you're never going to solve a case purely on evidence alone, or purely on computer forensic evidence. You want some sort of supporting data. Shipping and storage, probably been through this many times. There's things to consider. Typically, you won't get explosives or firearms involved, so the FedEx and USPS or UPS requirements aren't necessarily that important. Laboratory requirements basically suggest that you send in any kind of background information about the incident. Try and support things that way. Latent materials are basically materials where fingerprints are of interest. If you're shipping that stuff, be real careful handling it, obviously. Using gloves and packing it up, and most importantly, marking the box latent so that when it does arrive at the lab that they realize that there's a fingerprint component to that. Tamper-evident packaging is something that is just another one of those things that you can do because, again, it's reasonable doubt type thing. The more tamper-evident you can make the package, the more reasonably you can stand up in court, and if someone should ask about package in transit, you have your hopefully shipping information in terms of tracking numbers, fairly credible organizations doing the shipping, and some sort of tamper evidence on top of that would seem open and shut. Restricted access and low traffic camera monitored storage, like I was talking about the evidence locker with the motion detection cameras, low traffic and card access audited. And sign in and sign out for the chain of custody. The chain of custody documentation has to not only start where the incident occurred, but it has to happen in terms of checking this data in and out of the lab and the different devices as well that we're extracting that data on with. All right, so this is actually the other piece that was missing off the four up front that we talked about, acquisition, identification, evaluation. and presentation, and then there was incident response that came before that, but what can we do before incident response? This is where it gets really important, because as we go in to do this forensic work, what we're finding is that people aren't running process accounting, and therefore last count gives us nothing. People aren't logging properly, people aren't doing all these things right, so that when we go in to actually collect this evidence, it's that much less credible. And it's also that much harder on us. So how can we start looking at forensics a little more strategically and coming up with some stuff in terms of host hardening, and almost also to the extent of penetration testing, that you've got these audits you go through. What kind of forensic type oriented things can we roll into those? In terms of just procedures, starting right off the bat, having procedures and checklists, so that when an incident does occur, that the right things are being done. People don't have to be experienced to follow the procedure because it's documented, or your system administrator is new, the old one got hit by a car. Something that they can just pick up this thing and say, this is what I do when an incident happens. And tuning that over time is key. Having an evidence locker, again, a lot of people are storing this stuff in bedrooms or whatnot. Safety deposit box is pretty decent, in that the banks already take quite a bit of care in that regard. But we like to have our own evidence locker where we have a forensic lab, because we just need access to the materials that much more often. OS accounting turned on. This is where we start to get a little more on the sysadmin side than host hardening. Most systems don't have OS accounting turned on. Solaris does not by default. So if you get a default install, you're not going to find process accounting. You probably won't find that the accounting packages for user and root are installed, although you will find answer book. That's kind of ironic. That's the way people get in. You'll find that people are trying to save time or save performance cycles on their web servers, say, by NFS mounting up the documents and mounting that with no A time, so that fewer operations have to be performed. So they increase their performance at the expense of auditing, and that winds up screwing them if they do get popped in terms of going back and accounting for what happened. So you've got your basic OS accounting, as well as your network file systems and other quasi-OS level stuff. Log by IP numbers do not resolve. This will help performance as well. So a number of people are actually doing this just for the performance aspects, but there are all sorts of DNS tricks that can be pulled in terms of making you look like you came from somewhere you didn't. And other things are super long host names. If you've got a host name that's like media1-home network-257- something or other .media1.net, chances are what's going to show up in the log is probably about enough to say that maybe you're a Media1 host. Maybe the first 255 characters, maybe the first 50 characters of your host name. So quite often what you see in these logs is like chopped off host names, and you have no idea where they really came from. So logging by IP number guarantees that not only are you not getting DNS tricks going on, but you're also fitting the entire address into the bucket that's allocated for it. Clock synchronized. This is key, especially for international organizations that are or anyone that's operating in more than one time zone. I guess you don't have to be international for that. Synchronizing to GMT is key. Possibly synchronizing to GPS is a nicety. You have an NTP server at the AtStake Labs. There are some secure NTP protocols we're looking at right now, but right now we're just simply using NTP for network time, such that we can keep as many devices as possible in sync. And that's actually being fed off of GPS, so that we're actually in sync with total positioning system. That's where we get our time from. Let's see, evidence server. Having an evidence server on hand is great. I think a lot of people discount the idea of copying disks over the network with DD. Seems slow, but I've actually been able to get some pretty decent speeds doing that type of stuff. And it's so much better to actually pipe this stuff off the box than to have it on the box clobbering undeleted files or on any of the Slack space or other stuff on disk. So if you can get it off there to an evidence server, hopefully the evidence server has been fairly secure. The only thing it's running is the CryptCat listener that you're firing up at that moment in time that will last for that one session. Hopefully not a GUI interface on it. If you've got to run a GUI, some sort of IP filter or something like that, blocking people from touching it. But you want a hardened evidence server, definitely. Use of encrypted file systems, just something to think about when you're actually considering using encrypted file systems. Not a whole lot of people are today, and not a whole lot of people are considering them, but if you consider them, also consider that in terms of forensics. And then it'll have a negative impact on it. I'm sure it'll slow things down. Tools and materials, having them on hand is key. Go out and get the Corners toolkit. I did not bring quite that many CDs today, but I do have some swag to give out. We've got actually a toolkit that I'll mention right here. Right now. Came out a while ago just as a promo item. We came out with something we call the Pocket Security Toolkit. Looks like a business card, actually. The business card size slim. The goal of this was actually to have something that was bootable to Trinix with some forensic tools on it, as well as some auxiliary information. When we were making this cut, we haven't made a second cut yet, but when we were making this cut, in order to make the cut in time, we were not able to get this thing to boot. That's something we're working on. But there is a 2 or 4 floppy image of Trinix on here that you can pull off and boot from floppy, and then there are a number of all the utilities. Not only in terms of the Corners toolkit, but just some other generally useful stuff too in terms of local access to boxes, getting through local level security. Let's see, gzip, LSOF, MD5, lots of tools, and then also references, IANA port numbers and whatnot that you'll be able to look up. So I didn't quite anticipate this many people, and we are near the end of our supply at stake, but if people are interested, they can come up and grab a copy of that. And additional resources for those that are interested in this. There's the RSMP article on forensics by the FBI agent. It was really enlightening just in terms of like how to start looking at this stuff. Lance Spittner has a forensics page. He puts up a lot of tools. Mostly using Smart. But what he does is he goes and puts all these default installs out on this .edu domain that he's managed to acquire. And it looks like nifty little college that's got a bunch of default installs. I would practically break into it. But he's really watching the break-ins happen. It's of course he'll always be the mouse in that game rather than the cat, since he's relying on other people to come up with exploits. But he is indeed finding out what's out in the field with that stuff, and it's a really interesting use of this. Fish.com is where the Corners toolkit comes from. Basically, the /forensics page. I think it's about 2 months old, maybe 1 month that he's had that out. He's also been doing. Dan Farmer's also been doing some work, writing articles for dogs, and those are also related to forensics. Forensic toolkit, I believe that someone's here at this conference involved with that. I'm drawing a blank on that. CryptCat is the distribution for CryptCat, which is the two-fish enhanced netcat long play video recorders. Just for your information, that's only $350. You can get yourself a setup that would be motion-activated cameras with a 10-hour video tape recorder. Hopefully, there's a camera in one room and the tape them somewhere else. But that's a pretty cheap entry point, actually. The Solaris fingerprint database. This is actually taking those MD5 signatures that Great Robert collects with its MD5 tool and pumping them in and getting back what binary is associated with that. Hopefully there is one. Otherwise you're looking at something that's likely to be Trojan. And then there's some quick stuff down here. Inspecting your Solaris system for and network logs for evidence of intrusion. Just a little intrusion detection primer that hopefully you can abstract out and apply to other platforms. List of Trojan backdoor activity. If you're seeing some ports when you're actually sniffing, seeing the intruder come in on XYZ port, if it's unless it's something that they've compiled themselves, a switch port on, or the more common ones are listed here. Obviously, Diana is not going to list them. But that'll be a little starting point. And then testifying in court, I guess you guys may or may not be testifying in court, but should that actually happen, and should the intruder actually decide they're going to challenge the evidence, which seems to be the big problem today, if you do wind up testifying, they have some basic points. You probably want to get some extra help in the water. And that's it. I'll open it up to questions at this point. I'm not sure how we're doing on time. I started off a bit, but anybody has any questions? Yeah.
What kind of things do you have to assure the courts, say, to actually prove that grave robber is grave robber? Do you have to do any, what kind of assurance that you could put on that sort of thing?
Well, to one extent, the question was what kind of assurances can we give the court that grave robber is actually going about things the right way, or
yeah, and also the code base that you're using is the real code base.
Isn't the code base, right?
Trojanized.
The Coroner's Toolkit is all open source, so we start with the fact that the standards that the scientific evidence support have, they're pretty low for computer forensics right now. They're pretty low for DNA. Other areas they really stand up a lot better because the industry, the peer is actually reviewing stuff through journals and whatnot. Is it doing the right thing is really something that a lot of people have gotten to see the source code, argue it right up to the mailing list, debate publicly about the order of volatility and whatnot. So in terms of industry acceptance by peers, I think it's definitely there. Nobody is claiming that it's not doing the right thing, at least in the community that's looking at it. The second piece is that along with the actual toolkit, there is a signature that is distributed on the webpage as well, where you can basically MD5 the toolkit as it comes down and validate that at least you've got what's out on the distribution site. So people could, theoretically go beyond that, and it could get into basically something where you have to prove it. But I'd say, as it stands right now, the ground is definitely there for this to become the accepted way to do stuff, if it's not already pretty much accepted.
I'd be interested in some numbers. First, what about the average costs and time to do forensics, either in-house or using some optic services? And the other numbers I'm interested in is what are the average delays between the evidence happening, being detected, and then the forensic done on that evidence?
The questions were regarding cost of going outside with this type of work versus in-house. And I'm sorry, what was the second piece?
Yeah, the time delays between evidence happening, detecting it, and doing the forensic research.
So I guess the second piece was the time between the actual incident and the time that the incident is recognized and responded to. And that may be a number of different responses that come down. Typical, this is going to vary hugely from company to company, obviously, in terms of how comfortable they are putting this data out there. I've actually run into some companies where the lawyers didn't want to give anything out to the labs. So that's going to be a huge barrier right there in terms of the time delays to respond to the incident. Quite often the incident's actually occurring and nobody has any idea. The way that the last incident I was involved in, the way that it was actually discovered was that ISPX was DOSing some revenue-generating sites, and those revenue-generating sites got quite annoyed. The difference in time, it was actually about a month between when the intruder laid the toolkit down and when they actually launched the attack. what would have happened if the intruder did not decide to launch the attack 1 month afterwards, and say they were just holding it up for a larger attack once they gathered more victims to DOS with. I mean, that's going to be very variable depending on management's ability to give up that, or willingness to give up the data, as well as your ability to detect it. This company did have intrusion detection, but they weren't using it quite right. And as a result, it actually took an incident that involved them for them to be aware that their system had actually been compromised. So there's a huge, huge amount of variance in that. As far as the costs go, the cost of doing this in-house could be pretty minimal. One of the main things to account for here is familiarity with the tool set. If you can basically give a system administrator that understands the system that he's working on, it can't be, say, a junior level person, unless they're real ambitious with a practice system that they can trial and error type stuff. An average sysadmin could actually pick up this toolkit, and because it's so automated, basically with some instruction that could maybe represent one course that they've taken for either a day or a week or something like that, and a little bit of practice with the tools, become familiar enough to use them in a way that they won't actually stomp on the data, and will be able to do this stuff in-house. So that would probably be significantly cheap. The tool sets are free. Training, I'm not aware of any forensic training outside of their professional organizations that put some stuff on here. And then in the U.S., it's the High Tech Crime Investigators Association that does that type of stuff. So the costs, I'd say it's fairly cheap to get up and running in-house. Even if you're going as far as producing that evidence locker, that's only $350 plus the cost of a small closet. So these costs are definitely not mammoth. And in terms of outsourcing it, the boutiques tend to charge a good amount of money for this. Typically, they're working with law enforcement, the ones that I've run into. We happen to charge a lot of money just because we like to position ourselves to do strategic work as opposed to tactical. And as such, we don't want to get involved in a lot of the implementation and whatnot. If we do have to get involved, it costs a lot of money in our particular case. I'm sure there are other forensic boutiques that are using forensics as their flagship products, and they would be probably a lot more reasonably priced. Whereas what we're actually doing is using it to support a strategic relationship with a partner. One more question, anybody?
How are you dealing with kernel modules, modified syscall tables, and so on with the common toolkit? To detect changes, and because it's mutually exclusive, if you do it live, it depends on the kernel. If you do it offline, you may lose something. So how do you deal with it?
I'm sorry, we were starting with, did you mention Cisco, or did I hear that?
Syscall table.
Oh, the syscall table.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, so in terms of the syscall table?
Yeah, if the intruder changes and introduces a new kernel module, changes syscall table, everything which is LSOF and others.
Okay, good. Actually, that's a huge point. The question was basically about the reliability of the binaries, and I think that sort of ties back to the earlier question as well. The binaries in the Grave Robber and the Cornish toolkit. If the system has been modified in such a way, how are you depending on these? You're depending on a number of files. In the Cornish toolkit, there's a file called paths.pl, and that specifies the location of each and every binary that you're going to be running. So you could, with a CD like this, basically have a trusted PD, a trusted LSOF, all sorts of trusted binaries that you know have not been trojaned up at all, which will give you a reliable outputs.
Then these trusted programs go ask questions to an untrusted kernel.
Correct. And that's also why we have the external sources of data from log files and whatnot. If you can actually prove that something's going on over on the IDS and it's not showing up on that local host, chances are that type of stuff is going on, and you're definitely going, that's a more advanced attack than what you typically find in terms of people that are putting DOS tools out, or people that are running underground IRC servers. But if you are not getting the evidence that you think you should be getting off this local host, then you can actually go and coordinate that to network entries on DNS servers, firewalls, proxy servers, et cetera, you're actually going to be able to make a case for the fact that that system has been compromised and build your case out of the auxiliary data instead, using the lack of that data on the host as a buttress for supporting your case that the host level data isn't really what's of interest, it's the network level data. I hope that answered it. Did I interpret that correctly?
Okay, we're going to take, we're running about 5 minutes behind, but we're going to take a 15-minute break.